Mary redeemed a $50,000 cash prize playing Chumba Casino this year.
I was only playing for fun, so winning this was a dream come true.
Chumba Casino is America's #1 social casino experience. It's serious fun. With over 80 casino-style games to choose from, you too could win life-changing amounts of cash. Be like Mary. Log on to ChumbaCasino.com and give them a whirl. That's ChumbaCasino.com. No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details. The voice in the preceding commercial was not the actual voice of a winner.
Hello, and welcome to the Proactive Caregiving Podcast. As a CPA with over 20 years as an industry accountant, Jessica stepped away from the corporate world to become a full-time caregiver for her mother. Having learned invaluable lessons along the way, she is now here to share those with you and to invite you to join her on this caregiver's journey. Here is your host, Jessica Cannon.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're here with me today. I am the Proactive Caregiver, and I specialize in educating others on how to be proactive by empowering you, the caregiver. If you cannot take care of yourself, then you cannot take care of your loved one. You know, many of you know I found myself taking that last statement to heart when I took time off to heal from lower back surgery this past April. Although it was the most serious and invasive procedure I have ever experienced, it did not make me think of death or dying. Even when the hospital administration and nurses asked about having an advanced directive, I still did not think about death or my usual what-if anxiety-driven thought patterns. No, those thoughts came later when I had what was called a provoked pulmonary embolism 1 month to the day after my surgery. Then the thoughts of words left unsaid, relationships left in turmoil, and mom's care, her care needs with my own mortality came crashing in as I was gasping for air. Experiencing Dad's last few weeks alive as his body battled pneumonia made this kind of conversation about death, which we avoided so many times before, it suddenly became uncomfortably necessary with an intense weight of a pending reality. None of the decisions my sisters and I were faced with were expected or were anything we were prepared to do at the time or make. Growing up, these conversations were usually treated with sarcasm. They just didn't have to worry about death because once they were dead, they were dead. Not much thought went into what we needed as their children, what we would need or what they wanted as part of their journey home. And just to be clear, talking about death, it does not manifest it, but preparing for it while giving your family a chance to be on the same page is so important. Aside from terminal illness, no one knows when their day will come, but we can proactively face death without fear by working with an end-of-life doula like Melissa would. Before her work as a doula, she spent the last 25 years in naturopathic medicine and massage. She was helping people live a healthier life naturally. Melissa created her company, Peaceful End of Life, to focus on providing patient advocacy and compassionate guidance towards a peaceful end of life. And that is exactly why I wanted to have Melissa on with me today. Thank you for joining me, Melissa.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So, I mentioned that I had my moment, my fear. Have you noticed that working with people, that this conversation is avoided more often than not on death and dying?
It absolutely is, especially here in the West. I'm not really sure if we're not talked about it in schools or at home, but it's an interesting thing to observe that we avoid talking about it. We all act as though, well, it's not going to be my time, and this isn't going to happen to me. And heaven forbid you should talk about my parents getting ill because, they're not going to get ill and they're not going to die either. Nobody wants to be realistic And, we're all going to die. I'm sorry. We're human beings, and that is this process. And
Right.
certainly we can live a healthier life and try to avoid that day, but we shouldn't avoid the conversations around it. It is scary, but it doesn't have to be. And that's part of what I want to do, is to have those conversations with people to help alleviate their fears and the unknown things that they don't even know about, and just to make it so that it's not a scary topic. We can be well informed about this, especially as we might have parents or family members that are approaching the an older age where death is going to be more talked about. It doesn't have to be not talked about. It should be talked about. And that gives us power. It gives us knowledge. That information helps us to be able to handle things from a place of strength, as opposed to, oh my gosh, I'm in an emergency situation, and not only am I stressed out, I'm emotional, my family's emotional, nobody knows what to say or ask or do. Preparing for those kind of things ahead of time takes all that away, and you're of course going to be emotional, but you can think clearer.
Exactly. And I know one thing that I do want to kind of make a little bit clearer is that even as we're talking about this and as you're explaining this, I just wonder if we do have listeners that would automatically get confused because they're thinking, well, isn't that what hospice services are? Can you explain a little bit to me the difference between hospice and the end of life doula services?
Sure. First of all, hospice, for those people that a lot of people unfortunately have a misconception about hospice, and they automatically kind of think, well, hospice means somebody's imminently dying in the next week or in the next month. And that's not the case. Hospice can be involved from any time currently until somebody has a diagnosis that they might be passing away within 6 months or even a year. They can still be involved in that patient's care. But the main difference between us is hospice is going to be providing medical care. There's going to be a physician on staff. The patient may not see that physician, but there is going to be somebody behind the scenes. There's going to be a nurse. There's going to be medication, most often morphine or comfort medications for the patient. Those types of things are all done by hospice from a medical standpoint. They might come once or twice a week to visit with the patient, maybe for 30 minutes at a time. An end-of-life doula does not do anything medical. Most of us don't have typical medical training. We might have a nursing background. There's a lot of doulas that have been nurses. But in the doula role, our role is not to provide nursing care. Our role is to provide end-of-life support, emotional support, spiritual support, companionship. We are there as much as the patient or their family wants us there. Sometimes that means every day. Sometimes that means for a 14-hour vigil, which I have done myself. So it really just depends on the family, the patient, what kind of support they need. If they need support helping to plan a funeral, they don't even know where to start. They don't know about all the different options for a body at the end of life. Hospice is not really going to provide any of those types of services. Again, they're there to offer medical support and nursing support. Doulas are there for more spiritual and emotional support. So that's kind of the main difference.
Interesting. Very interesting. And that's why I noticed one of the things that came about on your website was you pointed out specifically about bringing non-judgmental support regardless of religious belief, lifestyle, or even as a member of LGBTQ community as a doula. Do you feel that people sometimes their beliefs are what inhibit them from accepting this process of dying and how to cope and deal with it?
I think that unfortunately, especially for LGBTQ people, it's not a belief necessarily, but it is unfortunately, they don't get the level of care. Oftentimes, some of that is starting to change. We've had quite the movement over the last several years Some of that's starting to change quite a bit, but there's still a pretty big gap. I mean, there are still people that don't want it to be known that they're part of the LGBTQ community, and they may not be married, and their partner is prohibited from knowing medical situations and things like that. So again, from a doula perspective, I'm going to service that client and whatever religious beliefs they have, their lifestyle, their family, to the best of my ability. I don't have judgment about those things. I do find sometimes that people, I've had it both ways, where sometimes people are super, super religious and absolutely terrified about dying. And I've had other people be super, super religious and are completely at peace with it and, just ready for the next step, if you will.
Right.
So it really, I have not found that it's, somebody's position on death is based on, whether they're part of a certain type of community or they have a certain lifestyle or whether they have a certain religion. Everybody's different and everybody comes from a different background. They were raised differently. We've often got family and ancestral stuff that is, been on us for our lifetime. So sometimes that's where some of that comes from, not necessarily religious background and other things. True. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very, very true. And I also noticed too, we actually had an opportunity to speak previously, and I'm just wondering how much of this, your background influenced your desire to create peaceful end of life. Can you tell me a little bit of how you experienced your own health issues and how that came about for your own issues of death and dying?
Sure. My background is that I was born to older parents. So while I was still in my 20s, I had to deal with both my parents getting ill and dying, and fairly close to one another. And then I had my own cancer scare right after my mother had passed away. So there was a lot of death in a relatively short period of time when I was still really young. And of course, at that time, didn't know anything about doulas or anything like that. That part came much later in my life. But it definitely, going through the cancer scare myself, and certainly the illnesses with both of my parents and their subsequent deaths, certainly helped form, it got me into natural medicine, certainly. So that is what prompted me on that path. But it also, gave me a look at the things that happen at the end of life and the things I saw that I definitely don't want to have happen to me. So I've, just made some, lifestyle changes. And my mother had liver and lung cancer, and my father died from Alzheimer's, and I actually have the gene for Alzheimer's, but it's not a guarantee that you'll even get it. So there are lifestyle things or supplements. So, that death certainly had an impact on my life and has made me make different choices.
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest takeaway from a lot of my experiences. Like when my dad passed and trying to really experience the loss and grief. But 2 days within his death, we had funeral arrangements and burial ground, trying to decide where to have him buried, and the stone, what to put on the headstone. I mean, just these details that I didn't want to have to think about it. I didn't want to have to deal with it. Yes, it was a grim reality, but at that same time, I didn't know any of that information until it was smacked face on, head on with it.
Sure. It's shocking. And, again, you've got to make decisions, typically in a relatively short period of time. So it can be often, super traumatic, and especially for, families with lots of siblings and, cousins, and there's a lot of involvement. It can be difficult for families for sure. And that's why I'm, that's why we're talking. We want to educate people about, you don't have to wait till the last minute.
Right.
And you can get information ahead of time. And especially if you've got a parent that maybe even has a cancer diagnosis and it isn't negative, or it isn't you're not thinking about failure to think about, well, what happens if my parent doesn't survive this? That's not being negative. That's being, kind of proactive about, look, I better have a plan. I better have questions, particularly from a financial perspective. If they don't have their wills done and, things like that needs to be done ahead of time.
Exactly.
So that's why we're talking. We want to educate people about not waiting till the last minute when it's stressful, like what you went through.
Right. And that's where these kind of conversations, they're always going to be uncomfortable. No one wants to think about their loved one dying or their spouse or their child. But when you're in these moments, it's too late to have that conversation of, especially in the scenario that I was in, Dad dying from pneumonia. In the last couple of days, he had a tracheotomy and he was completely unresponsive. And so we couldn't ask, Dad, do you want this?
Yeah.
Dad, do you want that? Do you prefer? And then making the decisions of comfort care, it was just, we were at that point, and that's why I love that you explain with your services, being able to help these people in the medical situations and being able to know what questions to ask. Because in those scenarios, for me, I didn't know what questions to ask. It was all reactive, not any type of proactive approach to it at that point.
Yeah. And, that's kind of, I went through, something similar with my dad when he was ill and advancing in his Alzheimer's, and he had a little stroke. And as a result of that, he lost the ability to swallow. And he already was at the point where he was not communicating verbally very much, and certainly didn't know me. But then now we can't swallow. Now we can't eat. And at the time, I had just lost my mother. I was dealing with my own cancer stuff, and the surgeons came to me and said, we have to put in a stomach tube. And I was like, well, okay, let's do that. And little did I know, I didn't know the questions to ask. And them telling me that we have to put in a stomach tube actually wasn't true. I could have made the decision not to do that because he was already at a very advanced stage. And all the stomach tube did was, make his advanced stage last that much longer.
Right.
So we've got to know about questions to ask medical professionals, particularly if they're not going to be forthcoming with all the possible scenarios and all the possible outcomes. And sometimes they just don't know to say all that and nobody's asking. But those are things we need to have. Those conversations need to happen with medical, particularly, preferably before there's a crisis like what you went through.
Oh, no kidding. And it's that scary scenario. I mean, I remember growing up, we've had family members that would suggest that my parents get us pets, goldfish, hamster, rabbit, or dog or something, so that as we were children, we would experience the feeling of loss and understanding what that means. But at that point in time, you're learning how to care and grieve. You're not learning the preparation of what that death is going to be and what the after effects are going to be.
Yeah. Fortunately now we've got, there's a lot more information on bereavement and grief, and there's more support groups, but, I understand they meant well as far as, hey, you need to experience this, but we need a follow-up plan, right?
Right. Yes. And a follow-up plan that's appropriate for the age, because I didn't deal with death until I was in my early 20s, and it was not a family member. It was an actual close friend to the family. And being around a dead body in a funeral home was even uncomfortable. It's those things that it's not the day-to-day things that you would normally experience, and knowing what to expect and what was allowed, what was accepted, what was respected, and what was understood. I saw people walking up to a casket and kissing the body, and I just thought that's the weirdest thing to me. So it's just, there's so many things out there that until they happen, these conversations could be those starters to just, let's not be afraid of this, which is why I love that you had explained to me that there are such things called death cafes.
Yes.
Can you tell me more about that so our listeners can understand what a death cafe is?
Death cafes are nationwide, and just for your audience, you can go to deathcafe.com, and they are basically held in pretty much all major cities across the country and probably internationally. I would imagine there's international locations, but it's basically a group of people that will get together, maybe once a month at a cafe, maybe a coffee shop or a restaurant or something, and meet and have conversations about death and dying, not about grief. This is not a grief support group. This is a, death, talking about death in a way that's going to be really positive, and that, there's going to be a mediator. Typically there's a host that's got some thoughtful questions that they could ask people, things to think about. I know like a very common topic is medical aid in dying. That's certainly something that comes up frequently in death cafes because, currently there's only 11 states that have that option. And so it certainly is something that's talked about. And the more people suffer at the end of life and the more people see the suffering, the more this is coming out that people want to have these discussions.
Yes.
But death cafes are super positive places to go to just sit and listen. And of course, with COVID, many of them went to Zoom. So you can, I attend a death cafe that's in North Carolina that's hosted by a fellow doula of mine. So, there you can go to one, even if there's not one where you live, you can probably find one online somewhere that you could attend, and you can just go and sit and listen. And it's there's always going to be an interesting conversation, but it's a super supportive place to go where somebody can just have a conversation about, hey, somebody's dying, and what kind of support could they get? Maybe they don't know about the fact that there are other ways to handle the body as opposed to, putting somebody in a casket in the ground or getting cremated. People often don't know that there's probably 10 or 11 other ways to have the body processed, however, many different ways that they might want to. So death cafes are amazing, and they're really great places for people to start out on the death talk in a nice, friendly way.
Interesting, especially if it's difficult to have those conversations with their family members. At least they have an outlet, a positive outlet that they can go to and ask the questions and hear other stories and go by their responses.
Yes.
And, and that's why I love, that's another piece of nugget of information you shared with me as well, is the documentary on Netflix called Extreme Measures. Finding a Better Path by Dr. Jessica Zeter. This is something, and I highly recommend the listeners to watch it if they get a chance to. This is exactly that perfect example of what happens when people avoid these conversations of death and dying and wishes for their death, when the family members are struggling by their bedside, whether it's in their home or in a hospital, not knowing what to do and emotionally not wanting to let go. Not knowing when to say, okay, they're on this terminal path. There is no amount of medical intervention that can actually stop this path at this point. And so that's in itself is difficult.
That documentary by Dr. Zeter is really it's very short. It's like 25 minutes.
Right.
And I actually want to make a correction to you. Her book is called Extreme Measures, Finding a Better Path. But the film on Netflix is actually called Extremis.
That's right. You're absolutely correct. Thank you for that.
Just so your folks can find it. And, especially given what's happened to all of us in the last year with COVID, there is no waiting. I'm only 20 or, I'm only 30. I don't need to think about these things yet.
Exactly.
That is not true any longer.
No.
Everybody needs to think about these things. Everybody needs a will. Everybody needs, some kind of plan for their children, for finances, for assets. All those kind of things need to be discussed. So, back before COVID, if you're under 40, probably don't really need to think about this, just a lot.
Right.
But COVID has changed the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And so, watching that documentary, and there's a lot of documentaries on death and dying
Mm-hmm.
that we can learn from, that can make, you just don't want to have your children sitting at a bedside trying to figure out what to do for you.
Right.
That's, and like you said about your dad, you're trying to navigate this traumatic, extremely stressful time
Mm-hmm.
without having the information that you need. So you want to try to have these conversations ahead of time so you don't have to go through that.
Exactly. Making those decisions and then having the guilt afterwards. Is that what he really would have wanted? Should we have
Yes.
done this? Should we have said that? Should we have gone this other direction? I think it took at least 2 years after he passed before I was starting to finally feel comfortable and accepting the decisions that were made as they were made in the real time, but it still haunted me afterwards.
Well, sure, because you didn't know, and you weren't, unless you have that conversation, not ever positive. So it's normal to go and second guess and question and think about, and that is very normal. But the only thing I could say is you absolutely made the best choices and decisions that you could have at the time with the information that you had.
Right.
We can only ever do as much as we have the information to do with. So, but again, why we're talking today is to encourage people to not be afraid to talk. And it's such a beautiful thing when you can sit down with your family and get these conversations out in the open so that everybody's on the same page.
Exactly. It is.
And there's
important.
easy ways to do that. There's card games, there's books, there's questions. There's somebody like me that can attend a Zoom, session long distance and talk to the family. There's a lot of ways to be supportive and talk with family. So it can be done.
Yes, it can be done and it needs to be done. Because I know growing up, my dad used to joke about dying, saying, just bury me in a pine box. Don't spend any money on me. And then my mom would turn around and say, just put me in a red dress and play Louisiana style music to celebrate my life. That was it.
There you go.
But those conversations, I just looking back on them, there was the funny, weird conversations as an adolescent, but getting that conversation going as an adult and feeling comfortable with it, no matter, especially when our parents, like you mentioned COVID and that age, death is not discriminatory. It doesn't matter what your age is or what your ailment. When it's your time, it's your time. And that's where that distress, that added distress, when it happens when you least expect it. And there's just a number of things to go through. There's stages of being in the hospital or not in the hospital, and from the hospital to the funeral, and from the funeral then the estate planning. There's just so many different stages to go through.
There are whether to have a service or not have a service. There's
right.
just and what type of service to have, and there's a lot to be involved, and oftentimes people don't know what to do, that you're not really sure how to what do I do first, and it's helpful to have somebody that can guide them, and the best thing is to try to work those things out in advance, get some of those questions answered, and how that person wants the things to go, how they want their service to be. And that when that happens, that's really lovely.
Yes.
When they can actually put all that down for their family, and it takes all the stress and all the pressure off especially if they have multiple children, because I've dealt with families where, the kids can't agree on how the services and how the after death care should be for their loved one.
So true.
And that is not the time to be having disagreements, but it happens all the time.
Of course. And these are the moments that the emotional distress brings out. Not
Sure.
intentionally, but it brings out almost the worst, and because of the fears that are based around this. But yeah, it's very difficult when everybody is not on the same page.
Well, and the other thing that happens when, you're a child and you're dealing with a parent, or especially if it's the last parent, if maybe your mom had already passed and now it's your dad is, his time is coming. It pretty much shines a really big spotlight on your own mortality.
Mm-hmm.
And that shakes people if they haven't had these kind of thoughts or had these any types of thoughts of the fact that, look, someday I am going to die. Most people just kind of brush that off and go, yeah, someday, but that's not going to happen for a long time. But when you're dealing with a parent or a spouse, or God forbid, a child that is starting to transition, your own mortality's got a big spotlight on it. And
Yes.
It's oftentimes your judgment gets skewed because of your own stuff, your own fears, your own concerns. And then you've got to try to deal with the person that's dying.
Right.
So it's a very stressful, emotional time. And there's just not a lot of support out there, except for doulas. We are more and more talked about. Every day I'm getting notification that there's an article somewhere written about end of life doulas.
Yes.
So just like a birth doula,
Right.
birth doulas are very popular now. They've been around for a long time. End of life doulas also have been around for a long time, but we're starting to be more common because people need the support. They need that emotional support and companionship, and maybe they need help with a conversation with all the family. So that's where we can come in to help.
Absolutely. And it reminds me of the saying I grew up with: death is what gives life meaning. Well, when you can have that conversation, and just like you said, it makes you focus on your mortality, it also makes you focus on how much you care about that person. So
Sure.
living life, and just with this assumption of I'm still young and I have plenty of time, which may not always, because none of us are guaranteed tomorrow and none of us know when our time is. So
Right.
that conversation may be uncomfortable, but at the same time, it may be the thing, or the go-getting kind of start of a new conversation that bonds you and brings you even closer than you might have been before.
Well, yes. And certainly it has the ability to do that when you're dealing with families, and, everybody can definitely be more bonded because, hey, now we're all on the same page about what mom wants, that
Right.
kind of thing.
Right.
But, personally, it's something I always tell people is, if you can, and this is going to sound very strange, but if you can just really embrace the fact that you are going to die, and really sit with it, what it does is it absolutely all of a sudden makes you realize, am I actually doing and living the kind of life I want to live?
Yes.
Because if you can embrace the fact, yes, I'm going to die, it makes your life now that much sweeter. It makes your job that much more important. I mean, and do you want to stay in that job? Is this a job that you can see yourself doing for the next 20, 30, 40 years, depending on your age? And if it isn't, well, now's the time to start making some changes.
Right.
Same thing for the marriage, same thing for, a lot of other important things in our life. Really talking about and embracing death makes us make better choices right now. We can have a better life right now. When I was a practicing naturopath and helping people overcome illness, overcome disease using natural medicines, those conversations were, it's like, hey, okay, you've got diabetes. Well, you don't have to have diabetes. There's things that you can do. There's lifestyle changes you can make. This is not the end of the world. And let's fix it now, because if we can get your body working now, you're going to have a better end of life, as opposed to accumulating all these illnesses
Right.
and taking all these medications that cause more side effects where you need more medications.
Mm-hmm.
The end of your life is going to look very differently than if you work to take care of it now.
I completely agree. Just completely agree. And it brings back to that whole mindset of being proactive instead of reactive.
Correct.
Yes.
It
And
does.
this is what I love, that your passion for this, and that you were driven to be more of that patient advocate and help people in this very odd, difficult, different way of life, living, and where there was a beginning, there's an end, and accepting that end.
Yeah, it's the acceptance, and it is, that's certainly one of the stages of the dying process, the grieving process, is the acceptance part.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's 50 years away, we don't, like you said earlier, we don't know. Our days are numbered. We are all actively dying every day. We're getting closer to when that day is going to come.
Yep.
And we just need to kind of be more proactive, and work on being open and having those conversations.
Absolutely. Sometimes the truth hurts, and having an end of life doula like Melissa helps to have that objective yet compassionate individual to lean on to get through these emotionally stressful times.
Well, and as far as the advocacy part, I love doing advocacy work because, just like what you had said earlier about, you didn't even know what questions to ask.
Right.
When your dad was ill. And that is often the case. People don't know what questions to ask. They don't, certainly the patient often doesn't, because they're the one dealing with the quote diagnosis. And maybe it's the end of, hey, we got to put you on hospice. So maybe it's that quote diagnosis that is a very hard conversation to have with the patient. Doctors do not have an easy job when they have that. But, their brain goes tilt during that conversation. So they don't know the questions to ask. And oftentimes they just get referred to hospice and off they go. But there's a lot more involved. There's a lot of other questions that can be asked. And even if we don't have a hospice or an end of life diagnosis, but we're dealing with an active illness, sometimes the question is, frequently for medical, it's always, well, what else can I take, or what else can I do, or what other treatment can I try? And the question should, sometimes be, should I do it?
Right. Yes.
Because the quantity of time that somebody has left doesn't equate to quality.
No.
And oftentimes the most important thing should be quality of life. I mean, I think that most of us want to have a good quality. Whatever time we have left, we want it to be a good quality.
Absolutely.
And sometimes treatments can make that not be good.
Right.
And the difficult deaths that I've seen, the rough deaths, the pain that's not easily controlled, and those are the ones that kept on with treatments that, maybe they might have made a different decision had they had the information, had they had the knowledge, and had they asked the right questions that they didn't know to ask, that kind of situation.
Absolutely. And that's really what this comes down to. Like we said, getting this education, this knowledge out so that it isn't such a scary area to face. Yeah.
We don't want scary. We want knowledge.
Yes.
Because that makes us powerful.
It makes it very powerful, because we're not working in fear. We're working through the knowledge.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Melissa, for taking the time to share this information to us and the listeners. And so how do our listeners find you to benefit from your services as an end-of-life doula?
Well, they can look up my website. It's peacefulendoflife.com. I've got articles out there, resources, information, and of course, you're welcome to contact me, and we can set up an appointment. I work through phone or Zoom or in person here in San Antonio. So I'm available to help in whatever way I can. One thing I do want to kind of make clear to people is you don't have to be actively dying. You don't have to have a diagnosis. You can just have a conversation about death, and we can talk about your ultimate, point when you're at that phase, or just questions you have about it. I have had consultations with entire families about their loved one who was passing away, very actively passing away. The loved one was fine. She actually was very okay with the fact that she was going to be passing away within the next few days. She was a nurse. She fully knew what was going on. The family, on the other hand, was not handling it well. It happened fairly suddenly. The doctors just kind of said, yeah, everything's shutting down. There's nothing else we can do. The family didn't know what to do. They didn't handle it well. We've got children scattered all over the United States. And so I had phone calls and Zoom with all the kids and not the actual patient that was dying.
Wow.
And likewise, I've had conversations with just the patient that was dying and nobody else. So, we're there to support anybody that feels like they want to have a better handle on this death and dying thing. And so I just want to make that clear to your listeners.
Absolutely. It's such a benefit. You are a benefit to our listeners.
Well, I really, really appreciate what you do and actively trying to help people in the caregiving roles and those communities of people. And thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to talk about end-of-life doulas and how we can help people.
Absolutely. I strongly believe that things happen for a reason, but I also believe that we do better when we know better, just as Maya Angelou said.
Yeah, exactly. What a beautiful quote to end.
So on that note, thank you for joining in and listening with us today. You can find more about this topic on the blog at jessicalazelcannon.com, just in case you didn't catch her connections on how to find her, Melissa Wood with Peaceful End of Life. I hope this gave you more food for thought. And until next time, be proactive. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. We really hope you've enjoyed this episode. To learn more about proactive caregiving and to hear other episodes of this podcast, please visit www.jessicalazelcannon.com. This podcast is produced by Cannon Light Media, LLC, www.cannonlightmedia.com. Music provided by Chris Paradise.
Lucky Land Casino, asking people, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
Lucky? In line at the deli, I guess?
Aha, in my dentist's office. More than once, actually.
Do I have to say?
Yes, you do.
In the car before my kids' PTA meeting.
Really?
Yes.
Excuse me, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
I never win and tell.
Well, there you have it. You can get lucky anywhere, playing at LuckyLandSlots.com. Play for free right now. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.